Kurt Volker has not only served as the US ambassador to NATO, he's also been the US special representative for Ukraine negotiations. Kurt, thank you so much for being with us. So you believe that both Ukraine and Georgia should join NATO. Obviously, that would trigger President Putin. He said that that is his red line. That is not a solution to this particular crisis. That would only escalate it. If that's not a solution, Kurt, then what is a solution?
Well, what I'm pointing out by saying that is that Russia is only attacking countries that are not members of NATO. If countries are members of NATO, Putin recognizes that there is a collective defense commitment. It is serious, and he's not willing to do it. Clearly, he is articulating a special right that he perceives to have a say over other countries, particularly Ukraine, Georgia, others in the region. And that's something that neither the United States nor European allies, NATO, European Union, no one can accept, that no one is going to write off whole peoples that live in Central and Eastern Europe to say that they're going to live under Russian domination.
At this point, Kurt, just in terms of where we go from here and how we de-escalate the situation, what solution is there to this crisis that does not involve NATO backing down or NATO softening its stance on who can and cannot join the bloc?
Well, the obvious solution is for President Putin to stand down his forces and not attack a sovereign country again. He did attack Ukraine in 2014. He took Crimea. He took part of eastern Ukraine. And he's positioned his forces now to have the capability to attack again. Now, if he doesn't do that, as Secretary of State just said in an earlier report, there's plenty of room to discuss and to try to find ways to make sure that Russia knows that no one is threatening Russia's security. Not Ukraine, not NATO, not any individual NATO states. There's no threat to Russia, so there's no justification for Russia to attack its neighbors.
Just in terms of what the US has said, they've obviously pointed out the situation is bleak. They've sort of said that, that they believe that there could be some kind of false flag pretext, etc. But they've also said that they don't believe, or they don't necessarily know at this point, whether or not Vladimir Putin himself has actually made a decision about if and when he plans to invade. If that is the case, what do you think will be the determining factor in terms of when and if Putin decides to go ahead?
I think if he sees that there is resolve and that there is a determination to assist Ukraine to help it defend itself, as has been happening by providing equipment, by providing training, providing political support, leaders from European countries going through Kyiv and expressing support for Ukraine. The more that he sees that, the more he recognizes that there will be very serious consequences for Russia if they do invade, and it's not worth it to Russia to do it. That's the best hope that we have. But as we've seen today, the situation seems to be deteriorating with Russian-led forces calling on civilians in eastern Ukraine to flee to Russia, claiming that there have been attacks by Ukrainian forces even against a government building there, which is clearly a planted operation. So the situation is increasingly tense.
As you know, President Joe Biden was vice president when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. President Obama took the heat for that. He took a lot of the blame for that. What do you think are some of the key lessons that the US president would have learned back then, 8 or 9 years ago, that he's applying to the situation today?
I think the most important lesson is that we were flat-footed. We didn't pay much attention to what Russia was actually doing. We didn't call them out on it. And before we knew it, they had taken over Crimea, run a false referendum, and annexed the territory. And we only reacted after the fact. So what President Biden and his team are doing now is being very vocal, pointing out everything that Russia is doing to threaten Ukraine in a way that is aimed at deterring Putin from following through, because there's no prospect here of deniability. Up until now, Russia has denied that it's attacked Ukraine, denied that its forces are leading those forces in eastern Ukraine, denied that it's a party to the Minsk agreements and has failed to implement them. But by calling out what the situation is day by day, as we are doing, we're making it impossible for Putin to maintain that deniability, and therefore making it more awkward for him to follow through.
Yeah, by speaking about it and listing all the different possible pretexts there could be for an invasion, they've made it sort of very difficult for Putin to catch the world by surprise, as he did in 2014. What do you think is the right way for NATO, though, to improve its readiness? I mean, if an invasion is likely, or if it's imminent, as the US says, if it's coming in any day now, what do you think that NATO should be doing to improve its own readiness?
Well, first off, NATO's first job is the defense of its own members. This includes the Baltic states, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania. And so what NATO has been doing is positioning some additional forces in those states as a signal to Russia that if there's any pivot away from Ukraine to attack NATO allies, we will defend those allies. That's a good start, but it's not enough because the actual threat is against Ukraine. Some NATO allies, including the United States, have provided real security assistance to Ukraine, but others have not. I think more unity in support of Ukraine's defense would be helpful, not necessarily to have soldiers fighting there, but to give the Ukrainians every means possible for them to defend themselves. I think also the messaging needs to be that we have an interest in Ukraine's security and sovereignty and territorial integrity. A lot of the messaging is how we are committed to defend NATO, but not Ukraine. That can be read by Putin as a green light. We need to show that we have a greater interest in Ukraine's security.
Yeah, and the mayor of Kiev sort of publicly asking Western nations to help him protect the city in the wake of, or in possibility of an invasion. All right, Kurt Volker, live for us there. Thank you so much.